our reflection on Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6 uh, in some ways continues on from the previous chapter. The Apostle Paul begins by looking at how relationships are to be lived out as Christians. He talks about family relationships, and then he talks about the relationship between slave and master. Now, sometimes this passage is used by people, especially those who are not Christians, to argue that the Bible is in favour of slavery and therefore it should be ignored. Actually, if you look at this chapter and you read it, then you actually realise that it's quite different. Yes, okay, it doesn't condemn slavery on its own, but what it does do is it focuses the mind on what the relationship should be between people. So the Apostle Paul is saying that just as uh, God sees people equally, so the way that we treat one another and the way that we look at our relationship should be equal. He says, Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. That's the same way as the Lord treats his people. Do not threaten them, since you know that he is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So there's no favoritism with God. Whether we're male or female, Jew or Gentile, or slave or free, the whole point is that God brings together. God brings together people from the opposite ends of society, and he says, you are equal in my eyes. I love you equally, and so I die for you, and I rise again for you equally, no matter what your position is in society. And so that's really what's going on here. Paul is not trying to either encourage or discourage slavery. That's not the theological point he's making. He's making a theological point that God's love can be for anyone in society and how that should play out into how we live our lives in relationship to one another. But I'd like to focus primarily on verses 10 to 17, which talk about the armour of God. We talked a couple of days ago on the reflection for chapter 4 about the putting on and the taking off of taking off of the bad self, of the old self, and the putting on of the new. And this has a similar theme, but this is talking just about putting on, and it's something that I think can really help us think through what it means to be a Christian, but also help us at the beginning of the day to be ready to serve God, to follow him, and to be his people. So the first thing the Apostle Paul says in this section, put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Even in this time of lockdown, we are faced with the temptation to despair, the temptation to put our faith in the wrong things, to look to the wrong places for affirmation and for attention, because we have been left to our own devices. It continues, verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. In other words, we shouldn't be looking to find enemies amongst other people, but actually because there is a spiritual battle, something that we cannot see, but something that is real. And that is, there is a battle of good versus evil. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the powers of the dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, Paul says, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. The whole idea is that the Christian person can be ready against all that comes against them, to stand firm and true because of what God offers us. And if we prayerfully consider these things and we ask God to give us these things, then the promise is that he will give them. Stand firm then, says the Apostle Paul, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist. The belt of truth buckled around your waist, as though truth surrounds you. There is no way of escaping from truth because you make the active decision to buckle it around your waist, to surround you, to hold you inside truth, not to be drawn out into lies, but to be embraced by truth. And then he says, with the breastplate of righteousness in place. The breastplate, the thing that keeps you safe in battle against spears and swords. The breastplate of righteousness, so that when the sword comes against you of evil, of temptation, the breastplate of righteousness can be put in place to shield you from attack. These are things we can pray for. Lord, give us this belt of truth. Give us this breastplate of righteousness, that we can be right with you because of Jesus, and that may shield us from all attacks. And it continues, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. Just as we put on shoes, that our shoes can be the gospel of peace. Can be the gospel of peace.